Hello everyone, my name is Kenneth McLaughlin, and in this video I'm going to show you some of what I do to make time lapses and to put those together in post-production. So in this video I'm going to be using Adobe After Effects to do all the work. Now, specifics of what exactly I'm going to be doing will apply to After Effects, but the general concepts, the things that I'm doing, will apply to any video editing software or any compositing software that you might use. So in After Effects, the first thing you want to do is obviously you want to import your time lapse. Now this will usually be as an image sequence. So in After Effects you just hit the first image of the sequence, and as you can see, After Effects automatically detects it as a image sequence. So we're going to go ahead and import that. Now, we need to do some things to the clip before we're actually ready to use it. And so as you can see, the frame rate for the clip is default 30 frames per second, which is fine for most situations, but in this specific time lapse, I actually want to use a frame rate of 10 frames per second. So we're going to go to File, Interpret Footage, Main, and then we're just going to change the frame rate to 10 frames per second. And hit OK. Alright, now the next thing we need to do is we need to create a composition. The composition is where we're going to do all the editing. So we're going to use 4K as our image format, and as you can see, the resolution for 4K is already keyed in, so I'm just in the right frame rate, all that jazz. It's already good to go. So we got that. Now we just have to drag our image sequence onto our composition, and there we go. So that looks pretty good to start out. So now basically what we're going to be doing is just taking some steps to make it look better and stabilize it, all that. So to start out, I'm going to apply an effect called Instant 4K. Instant 4K is a plugin part of the Red Giant Shooter suite, and it's a paid plugin, so if you don't have it, you'll have to buy it. But basically all I'm doing is, as you can see, the output size is just fit to comp width. So basically what I'm doing is this plugin is just resizing the image sequence to the composition resolution. So nothing fancy. So you can either do that manually just by scaling it, or you can use another plugin like Instant HD, which is also by Red Giant, but it's actually free. But it doesn't have the option fit to comp width. You have to dial in the resolution manually. Or Creative Cloud 2015, I think, has a plugin built in that will do this. But I'm not sure what it's called because I'm using CS6. But the main reason I'm using Instant 4K is because when you upscale or downscale footage, occasionally you can get artifacts related to that. And Instant 4K is a plugin that it's designed to do the upscaling and downscaling and eliminate any artifacts or anything like that you might get from just scaling it. So now we got that. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to use our Warp Stabilizer. So Warp Stabilizer is a plugin built into After Effects. All it does is it just stabilizes the footage. Okay. So what we're going to do here is we want to apply no motion. Now you might have something like a hyperlapse where there is motion and you want to set a smooth motion, but in this case we don't want any motion, so we're going to set this to no motion, and we're going to have to wait for that to analyze. I prefer Warp Stabilizer whenever I'm stabilizing footage. It's the best stabilizer I've ever used, but there are certainly many other stabilizers and a variety of software packages. So generally when you're making a time lapse, you want to stabilize the footage through some method. So we're just gonna wait for that to finish analyzing, and that'll take a minute. Alright, there we go. Our footage is now stabilized. So one thing to keep in mind when you're stabilizing is, as you can see, when I enable the Warp Stabilizer, it's slightly more zoomed in than it was before. And the reason is that when you're stabilizing footage, you actually lose some information on the edges of the frame, and you actually have to crop and scale the footage a small amount, and that amount will be larger if there's more shakiness or movement, but this was already a very stable shot to begin with, so there's not a lot that it has to do, but it is something to keep in mind that there is going to be some loss of footage whenever you do stabilization. Alright, so that's it for the initial working with it. The next thing we're going to do is some color correction and color grading. So when I shot this, I purposefully shot this in a very flat profile, and what that means is in my camera I turned down the saturation, the sharpening, the contrast, all that. I turn that down, and the reason is that you can give a much more powerful, much more controlled fine-tuning of the color when you do all of the modifications in post-production rather than letting the camera do anything for you. So to start out, we're going to apply two plugins. The first is curves, and then the second is levels. So the levels, we're not actually going to do anything with the levels, but the reason I bring in levels is just to have the histogram there because there's not a histogram built into curves. So when you're working with curves, if you're not familiar with them, basically it's just a ratio of the input brightness to the output brightness. So if we want to, say, increase the contrast, we can make like an S-curve like that. That's a fairly extreme S-curve, but you can still see the kind of the effect that has. So if I bounce back and forth, you can kind of see it's boosting the contrast. But one problem I have with just this basic S-curve is that it applies contrast to the entire scene equally. So even though, yes, we are improving contrast, we're actually ending up with our sky here being washed out, and then our hill and buildings being kind of blacked out. So I'm actually going to delete the curves, and I'm going to bring in a new curve. So in this case, what I'm actually going to do is apply essentially two S-curves. So the first one is going to be right here. And the second one is going to be kind of down here. So essentially what I'm doing, and this is kind of extreme, I might want to draw that back a little. Okay, so essentially what I'm doing is I'm utilizing the curve to apply the contrast to the sky and the hill differently. So as you can see now, both the sky and the hill are bumping up contrast without either one being blacked out or washed out. Now, knowing where to put the curve is mostly intuition from having done this before and having being familiar essentially with how to apply curves to this specific scene. But different scenes and different situations you may want to apply the curves differently, and that's why it's usually important to have some kind of histogram visible when you're doing that. And I was working on something where if this was a scene I completely had no idea how I should apply curves, usually what I'll do is I'll take a frame and I'll export that frame into Photoshop, which has a much more powerful curves tool, and I'll do the curves in Photoshop, and then I can get a feel for it in Photoshop with Photoshop's more powerful curves tool, and then I can bring what I did there into After Effects. But we're going to go ahead and delete our levels channel since we don't need the histogram anymore, and we're going to bring in the last thing, which is saturation. So when we apply saturation, we're going to, usually the way I do it is I bump up all the way. Now as you can see, there's a lot of really weird distortion, and that's because I'm pushing the color beyond the limits of the color space I'm working in. Now this is one area where After Effects is pretty limited. Because my initial footage that I started with is a JPEG, which is essentially a raw image format, I could push the color quite a bit more, but After Effects is only an 8-bit color space, I believe, and that severely limits the amount you can push the color. If I were working in a coloring application like Adobe SpeedGrade, DaVinci Resolve, or a more powerful compositing tool like Nuke, those have a much more powerful, much wider color space that would allow me to push things like saturation further. But for this tutorial, we're just going to be working in After Effects. So for this, basically, I'm just going to back down the saturation until, oops, that's not what I meant to do. Accidentally right-click. So I'm just going to back down the saturation until things look more or less normal. So I think the final number there, as you can see, is about 47, so about 50. And so if I remove and add that effect, you can see particularly the blues and the greens really pop after I apply the saturation. And like I said, I could go further and give a more vivid color effect if I was working in a more powerful application, but I'm pretty much happy with how it is now. So I'm going to go ahead and just play it, and After Effects is rendering it into the RAM. So I won't bother saving the whole thing. I'm just going to play back this little bit that's already saved. So as you can see, that looks pretty good, and I could work and I could stylize it a little more, make it look a little better. But in this time lapse, I'm going for a pretty basic, just basic effect essentially. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to export it, and if you worked in After Effects, exporting isn't a particularly difficult thing. Add to render queue. Just a couple things to keep in mind when specifically working with a time lapse, rendering it, is you always want to consider the format that you're going to be delivering your content in. So example, in this case, this content is going to be delivered to YouTube. So I want to keep in mind that format. And so in keeping in mind that format, I have a page bookmarked, which is essentially YouTube's guidelines for what settings to upload footage at. And so what I'm going to be doing here when I put in my render settings is just following essentially what YouTube has said are the best formats and the best settings to export at. And so that would be H.264 at 45 megabits per second. Yeah, that's pretty much it for 4K. Obviously, if you had like a 720p video, you would only need like 5 megabits per second bit rate. So that's what I'll be exporting at for YouTube. If you're exporting for any kind of web, H.264 is usually the best way to go. But with other, like when you're choosing render settings, essentially you're balancing quality versus file size. And for web video, you want smaller file size, that way it's easier to stream. But if you're working in essentially anywhere where you don't need a small file size, you want to have high quality. So say if I was just going to be saving this on my computer and showing it to people on my computer, and that's a situation where the file size isn't a problem, I would go for a QuickTime, and then I'm not sure if I can, yeah, I can change the codec. And then I would go for like an Avid DNxHR codec. Yeah, I think that's probably what I would go for. If you're on, there's certainly other good codecs for high quality 4K, Apple ProRes, Sony's XVAC, but I mainly work with DNxHR. But that's usually you want some high level, high quality codec for non-video exporting essentially. So we're just going to go ahead and keep the settings here that I have, the default H.264 settings for exporting this to web, and we're just going to go ahead and render that out, and we'll come back in a couple and watch our final film. Alright, so we've got our final time lapse here in QuickTime, so I'll just play it back real quick and show you essentially what I've created. But if you've done something similar, hopefully your final creation will look this good or better. as you can see. It's a little choppy in QuickTime just because it's such a large file size, but it looks pretty good. The color looks good, contrast, all that looks good, so I'm happy with it, and I'm going to go ahead and upload it. So that's pretty much it for my tutorial here on editing time lapses. So I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you learned something, and I hope that what you've learned will be useful to you in creating your own time lapses.